Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to the ASA webinar on lessons from the field on user behaviour and the value behind people-centric versus control-centric mindsets with guest speaker Rizwan Mood, who is the Director of Data Security and Compliance at eSafe Systems. My name is Susanna Palomo and I'm the Event and Sponsorship Manager for ASA, and I'll be hosting the session today. Assisting me today is Branko from the Sydney branch, and he'll be introducing the speaker and moderating the Q&A. Before we begin, I just wanted to go over some housekeeping. So Rizwan will talk for about 40 minutes or so. At the end of his session, we'll be taking questions. Please use the Q&A tool, which is located at the bottom of your screen, to type in your question. And we will obviously answer as many questions as time allows. This session is being recorded and the recording will be made available on the ASA website within 7 days. Thank you for your attention, and now I will let Branko introduce our speaker. Thanks, Branko.
Great, thanks, Susanna. Can you hear me okay there?
Perfect.
Fantastic. Right, well, thanks everyone for joining us today. It's great to have these webinars, and thank you to ASA and the ASA team that's behind setting these up. It's a great amount of effort and volunteer work that goes into that, and thank you to all those who've taken the time to join us today. I'm going to give a quick intro to our guest speaker today, Rizwan, and then, as Susanna pointed out, Rizwan will walk through that presentation. And please use the Q&A if you do have any questions as Rizwan's going through his presentation to raise them, and at the end we'll see how many we can get through, and we'll try and select a few to be answered, and if we can't get through them all, we'll try and get back to you on those in due course and time. So it's been a pleasure to introduce Rizwan, who has a passion to solve the human risks to data security, and has spent the past 10 years researching and consulting on human factors behind data loss and privacy, and designing security systems that aim to transform the mindset from a control-centric to a people-centric approach in the fight against data loss and cybercrime. His experience covers insider threat cases around corruption, insider trading, reputational damage, theft for personal gain, and accidental loss. Many of those have ended up in the OAIC statistics. His role for UK-based firm eSafe Systems, he's the Director of Data Security and Compliance. He's responsible for leading a consulting engagement in Australia and defining strategic direction for eSafety's product suites in light of the new security challenges and market trends. And with that, thank you, Rizwan. I'll hand over to you, and let's thank you very much.
Thank you, Branko, and thank you, Sue, for helping to arrange this thing. Welcome, everybody. So today we'll be talking about user risk. What are the different factors that impact this risk? What are the ways how we can address this risk? What works, what doesn't? And what's the value behind people-centric security in trying to solve this problem? But before we jump into all that, let's look at first why this risk is important in the first place. So I did some analysis of the recent OAIC reports, and I found that nearly 75% of those incidents relate to some form of human factor. Within the report, 32% straight away relate to human error. But if you analyze the malicious and criminal attack events and you break them down, you find that big portions of them are actually made up of stuff like phishing, rogue employee, insiders, theft of paperwork. The report even states that the reason behind ransomware is somebody clicking on something they shouldn't have. So it's a major factor now as far as Australia is concerned. But not only in Australia, what about international? There's a lot of stats coming out on a daily basis which put a lot of prominence on this particular factor of data breaches. This is from UK, where 90% of breaches reported to Information Commissioner's Office in 2019 can be attributed to some form of user error or mistake. And in the current situation, this is only going to get worse, because as more users work from home, and by the looks of it, this is going to be here for a while, we are placing a lot more trust on the users that they handle themselves and they have managed their behavior properly, they handle the data properly. And that ultimately means higher user risk. But it's very interesting. Although there's overwhelming stats available that says that this is a major risk. But whenever I go to many customers still, there's always this concept that let's not talk about user risk. Why is that? I mean, the stats are saying this is growing in its problem. Why we still don't want to talk about it? What's the key reasons behind it? So let us look at some of the factors that make up this user risk. Most of the stats, some of them which I have shown you and most of them which you would have seen as well, always blame human error as a key factor inside this risk. But is it really human error? When you start to look at these incidents, you find that a lot of it is users just trying to get things done. In fact, I can give you some live examples from our own monitoring. We monitored thousands of users worldwide. And we find that when this COVID happened and a lot of users started to move to their homes, started to work remotely, we saw a 50% increase in the number of data transfer that we normally find. There was a lot of movement of data to corporate sources, non-corporate sources, personal cloud drive, USBs, you name it. And the reason behind was patchy VPN connections, the servers were overloaded. Users just copied data because they just wanted to get things done. Is that human error? And then we have another issue, general carelessness. And I have the perfect example of this just from last week. The Earthquake Commission of New Zealand had a breach where one of the employees sent information related to 8,000 claims to one of their customers and their lawyers. And there is no better statement that explains the dilemma we call or the challenge we call as user risk than this particular statement which I have highlighted here. Unfortunately, a staff member last Thursday failed to follow several key security steps, including well-established password protection of the document, despite receiving the appropriate training. And if you follow this article, you'll find that it talks about layered defense, it talks about defense in depth, they have everything. But where did they go wrong? Is this general carelessness? Is this malicious intent? And as a solution, they are talking about implementing even more training. Will that work? And then there's other factors as well when we deal with user risk. A big portion of that is lack of knowledge, or what I like to call as clicking on stuff they shouldn't. Now, this has come into prominence in the last few years. And because of that, there's a lot more awareness happening. There's a lot more education exercise happening. We are trying to raise the security understanding of people. We are trying to tell them that this is a major risk for them, build their awareness with one objective in mind. All we want is that we want them to ask the question, is this real? What impact it might have? Or ask somebody else for help. Isn't it? That's what we are trying to do here. In the end, all we are trying to do here is how to make them more responsible. You will notice I have emphasized the words responsible and them here. Why do we use the word them? Is that the right approach? And there's some history behind this. Because IT security primarily started off as a way to protect against those foreign actors, the external risk, the bad actors, the faceless people. As long as we are protecting and protection against them, we can talk all ill words about them. They are the bad actors. And as long IT security in this context is the army which is defending the organization against them. So we can apply various tools, controls, methods in trying to protect the organization against them. But as user risks started to increase in prominence, The same analogy we try to apply the same analogy over there as well. But here the problem was different. These are not faceless people. You know them. They are our colleagues. We had drinks with them, lunch with them. And then there's another interesting problem, power dilemma as well. Many of them are your seniors. Can you really control their behavior? And interestingly, whenever a user risk happens, the HR gets involved, the legal gets involved, there's management meetings, there are committees. So is it really an IT problem to solve in the first place? Or is it a business problem? So let's look at some of the conventional ways of how we try to deal with this problem. Most of those conventional ways are very control-centric in their approach. They have a policy in between. They start from a policy in the center. It can be a data leak prevention policy, which is driven by a standard or a regulation that has to be complied with. That converts into controls. A control can be, for example, we are going to block USB for everybody, and that gets applied onto the people. Now, interestingly, if you dive down into those controls and why they were selected, there's always a story behind. And the story is always that you find that there was some incident that happened within the organization. Somebody forgot a USB on a train. Or somebody found a USB in a parking lot, decided to plug it in, and mayhem happened. And because of those bad behaviors, we are going to block USB for everybody in the organization. Doesn't matter you guys were using it properly. Sorry. We are going to apply a highly restrictive control and take away a perfectly legitimate tool which could have been superb in productivity, superb sharing tool. But sorry, that's not going to work anymore. And who makes these decisions? Normally it's done by IT, because they are responsible and accountable for all the risky decisions within the organization. It's their head on the chopping block. And because of that, they try to select the most strong preventative control they can get away with a lot of time. But that's also where the problem lies. Because in case there are certain group of users who genuinely want to use a new way of sharing data, new way of collaborating, well, now you have to run it by IT. IT have to think about it because their incidents are going to increase now. Who's going to be responsible for the risk that gets associated with it? How does that apply to everybody else? And because of that, it becomes very bureaucratic in nature and slow to change. And more importantly, we start to treat people as a problem. How can we convert this thing? How can we convert this thing where people can be part of the solution, part of our team? So let's look at some alternate to this approach. One of that is people-centric security. It was introduced by Gartner a while back. And what people-centric security or PCS does is it literally turns conventional security inside out. It says, since people are the biggest challenge here, they are the problem that we are trying to address, why don't we start with that first? Keep them in the center. People-centric PCS is all about trust-based strategy. Its assumption is everybody here wants to do good. They're not bad. They want to behave appropriately. They're not evil. The premise of PCS is that I as an employee have certain rights. And based on those rights, based on those rights, I can do my work efficiently, effectively. And with those rights comes responsibility that I will behave in a certain manner. I will behave appropriately, and I will not infringe the rights and responsibility of my colleagues, my department, or all the stakeholders within the organization. But if I do, there will be corrective actions that will be applied on me. And if those don't work, I might be subjected to sanctions or worse off, disciplinary actions. And that's the fundamental difference in PCS. Because of faults of a few, you don't apply restrictive control on everybody. PCS focus is on correcting the faults of the users who have performed badly, for example. Its focus is on addressing the problem at hand. And it does this by giving responsibility, accountability, and rights to those users. And by giving these rights and responsibilities, you have other advantages that come with it. You automatically open up your environment now. Under PCS, you don't have to have a lockdown environment because users now can take risky actions themselves. They are part of your IT security team. They are part of taking the risk-based decisions now. And with this, you automatically make the environment more nimble, flexible. Productivity increases. Your creativity increases. And in case of change that has to be implemented for a new standard that has come in, no problem. We don't have to now have committees upon committees with users and try to convince them on something. They are now part of it because they will be held liable as well. So it automatically changes the whole dynamic of how you implement security with those users. In other words, if you notice what we are doing, we're making it into a business problem or a business solution. And by doing this thing, it achieves what we all IT professionals aspire to achieve all the time. Make security everyone's responsibility rather than our own over here. So how does PCS achieve this thing? So at the bottom of it, as the most fundamental aspect of PCS is education. Education and PCS is not only about awareness anymore. Education is fundamental here. It's all about embedding the responsibility and accountability among those users, explaining to them that now you have liability as well of your actions. It's all about influencing their behaviors. And it's all about increasing their technical skill level as well. In PCS, you don't block USBs. You allow. You explain to them that what are the risks associated with you copying data onto it. What are more secure way of copying data onto it? Maybe password protected, maybe encrypted. But you're not going to block it from doing it. In PCS, you explain to them that there is repercussion if you click on those links without consulting. There are risks involved. So how can you do things in a more secure fashion? And in fact, education is a two-way process now. Because in PCS, users are coming out with new ways of sharing and they are saying, how can we use the same tool in a more secure fashion? So the role of IT changes into a facilitator, into an educator. But does that mean we are removing all the controls? Does that mean we are simply taking out all the security? On the contrary, in PCS, you need a lot more monitoring. But you are going to reduce those preventative controls. PCS is all about educate, trust, but verify. Now this trust but verify has been coined for a long time. It has been used as well. But if you apply trust but verify in a control-centric setting, it just results in a mountain of incidents. You just get heaps and heaps of incidents coming through because IT security is looking at them. 9 out of 10 times, they have no idea what these incidents are. So what they do is they try to focus on the key ones, leaving all the rest. Or worse off, since they can't manage that load, they go back to the preventative controls that we talked about in the first place. But in PCS, the trust but verify is supported by the responsibility and accountability functions that have now been applied onto the users. You're not alone in this battle to verify the incidents. You're now going to decentralize these incidents to the users who understand them. You're going to give department heads the reports as well, along with corrective guidance. They will be checking how they have performed as well. In many times in PCS, you have a form of a gamification that gets developed within companies, because one department is comparing that, okay, are we performing badly from the other department? So automatically there is a sense of improvement. And the detection and response process become far more efficient because, well, obviously you're not alone anymore. And because of we are correcting the incidents as well, as we go along, the actual incidents actually go down as well. But what if the behavior doesn't change? In PCS, there's a concept of trust space. You have the rights and responsibilities of each user, which forms the trust space. PCS allows you to expand that trust space if users are performing well. But in case users are not performing well, the trust space can be reduced. What does that mean? Meaning that if the corrective action didn't work, some of the PCS rights can be removed or even can result in disciplinary action. But the key thing here is we are not going to do this for the entire public. We are not going to do this for the entire organization. It's going to be user specific. So you're going to be able to control how you apply your controls and your measures in the overall organization. So what are some of the key elements of a PCS framework? Main thing in PCS is so that you need to define a set of mutual rights and responsibility linked to incentives and sanctions. Now this has to be approved by the top level. It cannot work without it. C-level has to sign off. But then it's not only them. All the users who are going to be part of the PCS strategy have to sign off on these rights and responsibilities. Only then it works. So it's actually a cultural change. We are actually forcing a cultural and a mindset change among the entire workforce of the organization. And then PCS has to be supported by a very strong educational program. The education levels have to be far higher. It has to, because the education now has to explain to the users their responsibilities, it has to evaluate their technical skill level, and more interestingly, in PCS, education has to be verified as well. Because without verification, you really don't know whether the new techniques and methods that we have taught them is actually working. And interestingly, that verification is self-driven. Because now since users feel that they are also can be held liable, they actually go to IT to say, well, can you help me out? And of course, the underlying is that you need to have visibility. You need to have those monitoring controls, the SIEMs, the DLPs, the endpoint detections, all should be there in order to facilitate this strategy. So wherever I have implemented PCS, I have found transformational benefits coming out of it. And this is also said by Gartner as well. And some of the things, one of the best benefits that I normally see is that security failures are increasingly not viewed as IT failures, but as user failures. There's the detection and the response processes is now on steroids, literally, because you now have more users engaged in that process. You have more users correcting their actions, which automatically reduces the number of incidents that you have to deal with. And you are able to solve complex scenarios like fraud, which you had no idea about in the first place, because people who understand information are also looking at it. So they can pick up those anomalous activities. And the best of all, the one which is truly close to my heart, we are no longer seen as an obstacle, as an enforcer. We are seen as a facilitator, as an auditor, as an enabler. But is it for everyone? No, it's not for everyone. It works best for roles that require greater autonomy, in my experience. Management, information owners, knowledge workers, not-for-profits, lawyers, architect firms, local government. Will you apply PCS to a front-end branch of a bank in consumer banking? No, you won't do that. It's just going to result in a lot of management overhead for no reason. But will you apply it in investment banking? Maybe yes. So it's in an actual setting, it all depends on the level of autonomy and the trust you have on those users. And that's how it actually gets implemented as well. In most organizations, PCS works with the conventional control-centric security because every organization has all those users as part of it. There are some users who might be in junior positions or who are doing very specific jobs which are highly regulated. They don't need PCS, whereas there are other users who are knowledge users, who are senior management people who you trust anyway with information. So PCS and conventional security normally gets implemented together to try and solve the challenge that we have, which is user risk. And that's all I have for my presentation. Thanks for attending. I can see there are certain questions that have been asked up to now.
Thanks, Rizwan. Yeah, so we've got a few questions here. Thank you so much for that. That was very interesting. I think the questions really revolve around some of the challenges and some of the effectiveness around the approach. And to your point at the end there, it's not for everyone. So we've got to keep an open mind about this. So I'm going to just jump into some of these just random at the moment. Some are more extensive in terms of the questioning, so bear with me as I read some of these out, and some are short and succinct. So I'm going to start with, I guess, an easy one from David. So David's asking, some companies already have zero trust strategy in place. How will PCS work?
Excellent question. Zero trust in my book is a fancy word for trust but verify. Zero trust is built on trust but verify. If you look at it, what we are trying to do here is to build the same zero trust among humans now. We are trying to build that capability among humans by building the same philosophy, if you notice. It's all about trust and verify here as well. But there's a difference here. The difference here is that most of the leakages that happen are not by unauthorized users, but they are by authorized users. So you have to go beyond the zero trust now. Those incidents that are happening, like if I copy something on a USB, I'm an authorized user and I lose it somewhere, I was trusted. I was verified. Everything is there, but I did that action. So PCS goes beyond that. It goes beyond that and it holds that person responsible as well. So it's really trying to change the psyche between the years here. That's what PCS is trying to do. And yes, it will be applicable in that environment because of the reason I just gave.
Excellent. Thanks, Rizwan. Another one here from Mohammed. And Mohammed starts out by saying, question from a novice, but all questions are welcome. So in the current environment, most of the data-driven workers are working from home. What's your view on virtual workstations so that the security tunnel from the user to the organization is protected?
I mean, data protection that's a question which is, it wouldn't directly relate to PCS primarily because you're trying to protect data. From what I understand, you're trying to protect data within the tunnel coming to the endpoint, and that should be done. Data should be protected wherever it is. Whether it is on your device, in the cloud, in transfer, that should be protected. But what PCS is going to do go beyond that. PCS is all about how users behave with that data. I, as an authorized user, sitting at home, print a file from my home printer. Who's liable for that? I lose that in a coffee shop because now we are allowed to do that. Who's liable for that? That's the problem which PCS is trying to solve, because those are the incidents that we are actually seeing appearing in all those stats.
All right, thank you. Well, the questions seem to be piling and rolling up at the moment. I'm going to go to a bit of a tougher one. Just a bit of a pre-warm up there. This one here is from Andrew. And Andrew's asking very early in the piece, so maybe this question's not in full context of the whole presentation, but I'll ask it here anyway, and bear with me, it's quite lengthy. Okay. What are your thoughts on removing the human components for a lot of these issues, e.g. manual processes, controls not followed, clicking on phishing, etc.? For example, Google's implementation of MFA is frequently cited as preventing successful phishing. It seems like the wrong approach to continue reliance on the human firewall. Upkeep of processes and awareness activities is substantial and frequently fails. So there's a lot in that, but I think it's a general thought piece.
No, I think it's a brilliant question. And you see, the concept of PCS, let's go back to the concept. The concept of PCS is that we are going to allow more freedom to the users. But we are still the facilitator. We are still the auditor. So that means we are going to try and mold their behavior as well. We are going to guide them like children, basically. We're going to guide them on the right track, but we will give them the freedom. So any tool that you can use to minimize the risk, MFA, applying any kind of security on phishing, that it shouldn't come in the organization in the first place, is all welcome. It's not, PCS is not against that. But what PCS is trying to do here is, coming back to your human firewall question, after all is this validated, how will human firewall prevent the incident that happened in New Zealand, the one which I showed in the start? How will that prevent me sending data to somebody who's wrong, a wrong recipient? So you still need some factors or some way of molding those behaviors. And that's where PCS come into picture. I hope that tries to address your question actually.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew, if you feel like it's not, just pop it back on the Q&A forum, and we'll try and get back to it, because it's a good question.
Yeah, absolutely.
And hopefully we can get it. We got a little bit of that to what you're thinking. There's two questions here that are quite similar. So one's from Simon and one's from Stuart, and I'll probably just, if Simon, that's okay, I'll probably take Stuart's and get Rizwan's view on this one. Is there any psychology data available for human engagement strategies? So how do we engage? And you mentioned in your presentation carrot, stick, consequences, and also collective group management. Do you have any extra ideas, resources about user engagement and working past security fatigue?
I mean, there are some stats available. I don't have it with me, but probably we can share with you on those. But IT security fatigue is a big issue right now. I mean, the amount of incidents we are getting and the amount of new tools which are being put in, and that's primarily the reason more and more companies are opting for a SOC rather than do this themselves, because it's all because the number of incidents are just piling. So there has to be a change, isn't it? This cannot continue. Previously, we were just dealing with external risk. Now we have users to contemplate with. So we have to change this mentality, isn't it? We have to have a new way of dealing with this. How can we reduce these incidents in some way, form? Andrew has a great idea. Let's reduce those incidents in the first place, but there should be some additional methods as well. And yeah.
Just to that point, because I think that's a two-part question really, but maybe the first one, which is a broader one, I think it's also from myself as well, is like, how do you get that engagement with users? And you said the top, one of your comments was the top level, the board, the C-suite. How do you get them convinced that this is a framework they should implement PCS into their organisation? Also understanding it's not right for each organisation. What's the psychology behind that, and how do you get engaged beyond compliance, click, tick, the earthquake? We've done the training, we'll do some more training, but how do you get that genuine engagement and psychology behind it?
Yeah, so the main thing here is that when you're dealing with top management here, there is actually a carrot for them, because interestingly, in my experience, most of the breaches that actually hurt a company always comes from the top side. It's always top heavy. So by showing them that with this approach, they will actually have more freedom, you can start to get their buy-in. And user risk is something which, in my experience, is something which even the top management understands. It's not something those highly complex that you're teaching them that a breach can happen from X, Y, and Z method. This is quite simple. This is like, well, you have data on your USB. If you forget it somewhere, we are going to be liable. So the concept is pretty simple for them to grasp. And that's where I like to start up with simple examples, showing them that what are the risks that they are going to be facing or their senior colleagues are going to be facing, and how this will actually help them to improve on that. And normally you don't implement PCS as a big bang approach. I mean, we always do a pilot of this thing. We select the department, and the department I like to start off with is always the top management department. So if they have a group of all the top managers, you can start with them first in this PCS approach, because they themselves can see that, okay, these are the mistakes I have done. This is how I can correct my actions. And if they see value inside it, automatically it gets enforced into the entire organization.
Thanks, Rizwan. That's great. I think we can't not go past having a question here, just scrolling back up to kind of lead to it a little bit. And we're getting loads of questions, so we'll try and get through a few more.
Sure.
Let's see, where was that one? Sorry, apologies, 1 second. Here it is. Again, thank you, Rizwan, for the presentation. Certainly turns heads the ordinary accepted approach to security on its head. I'm interested to hear your thoughts whether PCS is compatible with ISO 27001 compliance. So we have to have that in there.
Yeah, it's actually a brilliant question. So without going into a lot of detail about ISO 27000, you see, when you're applying a control, controls can be that I'm going to block a USB or I can encrypt a USB. A control can be multitudes of things, isn't it? When you're talking about PCS, right, the way you're going to look at a standard is what is the standard actually trying to achieve? The standard, all standards, you know, ISO, NIST, GDPR, or regulations like NDB, in the end, they're trying to say that we want to make our environment more secure. So PCS is more about that. Instead of looking at each control and say that we have a check in the box, we have got these controls, without thinking that there can be hundreds of other scenarios which because the standard hasn't yet been updated to that level, we are not going to talk about it. No, PCS forces you to talk about it. So it's actually facilitating ISO. And it's one thing that you mentioned, it's a good thing you brought ISO, because ISO is one of the few standards I saw that talks about information owner. It talks about importance of that has been placed on information owners actually. And PCS is all based on that. PCS is saying, let's engage with those information owners. Let's not use them only for classification purposes. No, let's not stop there. Let's go beyond that. Let's go and engage with them and get them also engaged in the corrective process as well. So I personally feel it works quite nicely with ISO actually. Yeah.
It does, and I think it's part of that. It's kind of like it converges with it. It's probably nothing you can really audit because it's cultural, right?
Yeah, it's cultural, exactly.
Back to your point about, you know, get some metrics and verify education, right, to see that it's working. And I get that. So I'm going to touch on a few comments here that I mentioned earlier about the approach. Andrew mentioned something around the view of, you know, you're almost waiting for the incident to occur and then you're trying to correct the behavior. Is that a suitable approach to you know, PCS, or is that just not a PCS problem, it's a very broader problem?
I mean, it's actually a very interesting point that you raised actually. Of course, you see, in the start, I talked about where IT security is coming from. It's coming from a very control-centric point of view. We have those controls and we are putting in place those controls. The problem is that the stats are showing us that the controls are not enough. That's what the stats are really talking about, right? They're saying that there is actually another element to it, which is the cultural one, which Branko just mentioned. There is another cultural side of it. There's another human side of it. So you can try and morph those controls as much as you can, but do remember, the more you morph, the more preventative your environment will get. how sure will you be that the users are not trying to find another way or using a camera to take a Photoshop to get their job done? So we have to find that balance, isn't it? So and PCS is all about, I understand where you're coming from, that you're trying to solve the problem after it happens. Of course, we are trying to address it before as well, but educating the users. So education is fundamental here. We are showing them what are the risks. So it's an ongoing policy of improvement, and with the focus is now the users rather than just relying on pure technology anymore, because technology can fail.
Yeah, that's a good answer. So I've got a few just general, lots of thank you for the presentation. Also, if you can actually see the Q&A, I assume you can, those that are on the call, there's some good comments and some references there. We'll share them out to the broader community post this webinar. But I think I'll leave it with one more question. I think this one will come from Peter, and then we'll say we might bring that to a close. So Peter is asking, Rizwan, when implementing a PCS framework, and you mentioned sign-off and accountability at key level and specific user level trusted, where does the buck stop with accountability, or where does the finger get pointed to in the security breach? Does it fall back to the CISO or that particular user in management?
Now it's going to be shared. That's the key answer here. So the accountability side is, first of all, it depends on how low you have taken PCS implementations. Sometimes PCS implementation stops at department head level. It doesn't go to per user level. So now the responsibility will always be shared now. So you can't really hold the CISO solely responsible. You have to get that user involved, because I mean, that's the biggest dilemma we have, isn't it? The moment there's a breach, it's easy to just chop off the head of the CISO and get a new one to say, well, he will do a great job, and the cycle repeats itself. But the problem is not there. The problem is with the users, isn't it? So we have to get them involved in this process. I'm starting to talk a very negative tone to this thing, but the whole philosophy is about corrective action actually. So when you implement something like that, it's based on the understanding that things will go wrong. They are going wrong even now. So we are going to start to improve on that element by putting in corrective actions as and when they actually happen, rather than saying that a breach happened, sorry, you're out of your job. So that's the whole philosophy change. And that's why the responsibility has to be shared in PCS. But ultimately it has to be signed off by basically the chief executive, actually. This has to be signed off by him, otherwise it doesn't get implemented properly.
It's always a difficult one, where does the thing like this finger pointing, and that's a bad culture in itself if there is a finger pointing.
Yeah, it's really a bad culture.
So I think a good culture is a shared culture, but there are difficulties around organisations needing to hold someone accountable, for the purpose of shareholders and responsibility to kind of show ownership and that they're addressing the issue. So unfortunately, maybe shared is not an approach for those. But again, it's not for everyone in terms of the framework. So there's lots of praise here, and I apologise, we're not going to be able to get through all of these questions. And Rizwan's emails, I assume, Rizwan, if you're happy to take these.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
And reach out to him directly, connect to him either through LinkedIn. As a community, we're a community of professionals here, so we're quite open to this discussion. It's about knowledge, learning and connecting, so really appreciate that. I think I might call it there, and I'll hand back to Susanna to close off the call. Thank you everyone for attending. It's been a great talk. Thank you, Rizwan. I really appreciate your time here today. And just a last point on this is, yes, this will be available. The recorded session will be available on the ASO website. Probably give us about 3 or 4 days to kind of get that out there. You should see a link come out to you in your email, in your inbox. Be on the lookout for that. But thank you everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks Branko. Thanks Sue. Thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you. Thanks, Branko, and thanks so much, Rizwan. Thank you for your time today. We really appreciate it. Thank you to our members who put in their questions. So thank you for your time and your participation. As Branko mentioned, and also in my opening, the recording will be made available on our website under members only area within 7 days. For more details on other upcoming events, please visit the ASA website at asa.org.au. And again, thank you for your participation, and goodbye.